What I'm going to talk about is some research I've been involved in for about the last 8 years or so, and it's been focusing on the first humans in Southeast Asia. This is a family tree of the hominids, and it includes basically everybody who's related to us one way or another, and the chimps and the gorillas are down here. But what we're going to be focusing on tonight is this part of the tree right here, okay? And this is an important part of the tree because it's right here where the first humans come out of Africa, okay? And so that's what we're going to be kind of talking about. First humans actually start in down here with Homo habilis. Okay, so why Java? Okay, well, what's the interest in Java? Well, Java is a really interesting place because it all started there as far as human fossils, early human fossils anyway. This guy, Eugene Du Bois, discovered what he called Pithecanthropus erectus, which has since been called Homo erectus, along the Solo River in central Java at a place called Ternel in 1891. And Du Bois was a ardent follower of Darwin. This is 1891, okay? This isn't too long after Darwin's Origin of Species came out. And Darwin, you may know, was a proponent that humans had evolved in Africa. Du Bois and another large group of people thought that Asia was the cradle of human evolution, and so he set out to find those fossils and that evidence of that human evolution. This is Du Bois here, and he did. He found this site at Ternel where he had some cranial remains, calottes, as well as some long bones and a few other remains that were obviously human of some sort, but were definitely not modern humans. So this sort of got people excited, and people started going to this part of Southeast Asia more and more to see if they could find some more. And in 1931 to 33, the Geological Survey of the Dutch East Indies had an expedition, mostly a fossil expedition focused on vertebrate fossils. But in the process of doing this, they discovered a large deposit of Homo erectus or Pithecanthropus erectus at a site called Nandang in central Java too. And so this sort of reignited the excitement for Javanese Homo erectus. You might be aware too that around this time and a little earlier, there's also Homo erectus finds up here at Choukoutien in China, which became a really famous place, and Peking Man, so basically this whole part of Asia became sort of the place where everybody was looking for our first ancestors. This continued on with this guy, von Kongswald, who discovered Homo erectus remains at a place called Sangaran in 1936. And this became important because Sangaran's been the place where, until fairly recently, most Homo erectus fossils have come from, the most Homo erectus fossils. And really large collections came from there. So that basically today, more than half, still after all this time, more than half the world's Homo erectus fossils come from Java, that single island. And so it's an important place just by sheer numbers. Because of that, there's been a fair amount of interest. That interest, though, sort of faded because in the 50s and 60s, Louis Leakey and his colleagues working in Africa in the Rift Valley found some earlier hominids, eventually humans, and then subsequently Homo erectus has been found in the Rift Valley too. So now this is a map that's not correct, but shows where Homo erectus fossils are distributed around the world. These in here aren't really Homo erectus. This one is questionable. It's tools, no bones. But you can see Homo erectus is pretty cosmopolitan. There's quite a bit of Homo erectus around the world. The general idea that we have at this point of the game, or that is that basically Homo ergaster, which is an immediate descendant, some people think of Homo erectus, okay, or Homo erectus, left the Rift Valley sometime around 2 million years ago. And once out of Africa, the Homo erectus moved to Southeast Asia and Asia. Okay, so there's this huge dispersal, and the question is, what was the pathway, what was the timing, all this sort of stuff. And this is, I think this map is out of National Geographic, and that's not a Homo erectus site, we know now. Rewad is questionable, and we're going to throw a bunch of questions about this being an accurate kind of route. Okay, so questions we had, and we've had for the last 8 years that we're trying to at least address a little bit, is basically what's the record of Homo erectus migration from the place of origin to Asia, okay, to East Asia. What environments did Homo erectus inhabit? We know pretty well what Homo erectus and what the predecessors, its ancestors, inhabited in East Africa. The question is, today, Southeast Asia is a pretty different place than East Africa, and what kinds of adaptations were needed, or were there adaptations needed? And then finally, what does this Southeast Asian Homo erectus record tell us about global change and early human dispersals? You know, why did people leave? Why did they go where they went? Was it driven by climate, or were other things involved in it? So, to try to answer those questions, we have a few objectives, and this is what we wanted to focus in on in our central Java work, okay? Because we thought we could find out some of this stuff, and this was things that weren't known yet and that could bear good information on those questions I just laid out there. So first of all, we wanted to reconstruct the paleogeography, and that's basically just what did the land look like? You know, what was going on? Was it a river? Was it a lake? Did it stay the same all the way through time? Did it change, okay? And what was the paleo environment like? So what kinds of plants were there? What kind of animals were there? What kinds of, you know, adaptations were needed for Homo erectus to be in this place? And for both the arrival as well as the duration of Homo erectus being in Java. We also need to develop some sort of a reliable chronology. We have to know, you know, what age various things are, how long things last, in order to compare one place to another place, to time together in time is an important thing, okay? In order to do that then too, we need to understand the stratigraphic context of the fossils. So we really have to know what kinds of deposits are the fossils in, what does that tell us about how the fossils ended up where they are? The age of the fossils in some cases, what does it tell us about associations? If we find Homo erectus fossils and fossils of other animals, are they associated or have they been delivered to that place by a stream, for instance, okay? And then finally, we want to document the local environmental conditions during Homo erectus occupation, because that's going to tell us about what Homo erectus was adapted to, the environment that they were living in at the spots that we were finding them, okay? And then finally, in Java, as you'll see in a minute, we also have to talk a little bit about volcanic activity, and we have to talk about global climate change. So there have been sort of two different teams, not really different, but two different groups of people. This group of people here works primarily in a place called Sangaran, which I'm going to talk mostly about, okay? And this group down here has been the most recent expeditions we've done at Nandong, which is the youngest Homo erectus, we think, in the world. But anyhow, I just want to point out, this is Rush Shahan, who's a professor of anthropology here. He's the grand poobah. He's the guy that really wanted to do it, get it going, and has been sort of the driver behind this thing and assembled the players. His Indonesian counterpart is Yadi Zayam, and Yadi is a paleoanthropologist and stratigrapher who works at ITB, which is the Institute for Technology in Bandung. It's like the, Caltech of Indonesia. And Jan Riesel, who's also at ITB. Another person, this guy right here, Roy Lerick, was really instrumental in sort of getting this whole paleogeography dating thing going. Okay, he's an anthropologist, was very much into that. And then there have been Scott Carpenter, who used to be at the University of Iowa, helped out with isotope work, and Andrew Wolf at Western Kentucky University has also done some work on some of the volcanology. And so it's a whole host of people. And then down here, a bunch of other people, some guys from Rutgers, and also we've got two students from the University of Iowa that are working with us down here now too. Okay, in order to start this out, we need to talk about how much water's in the ocean. Seems like a weird thing to talk about, but it's an important thing, okay? This is a a diagram that is it's what's called an oxygen isotope curve. It basically tells us something about how much water is in the ocean, okay? Anyway, that's one way of looking at it. When you're over on this side, this is a lot of water, like today, it's right up here. When you're over here, it's a lot less water, okay? And over here, where there's a lot of water, that's an interglacial period or a warm period, okay? When there's not much ice on the continents. Over here, when there's not much water in the ocean, that water is tied up in glaciers on the continents, okay? So the other thing that this kind of does for us is it tells us something about sea level, okay? And it's amazing how much water glaciers can take out of the ocean during a glacial period. During the last glacial period, during this one right here, sea level was 120 meters lower than it is today. Really, really big time, okay? So anytime we're on the yellow side of this line, we've got at least 60 meters lower sea level. Why is this important? Well, when you take a bunch of water out of the ocean, you expose shallow parts of the ocean, okay? And you know, the classic one is the Bering Land Bridge, which probably all of you have heard about. This is supposedly how people got into the New World, okay, as well as a bunch of other fauna that came across here during the last glacial period, or maybe the one before that, who knows. But anyhow, they're land bridges. They provide avenues for animals to move across that otherwise wouldn't be able to. It's too far to swim, whatever, okay? So we can take a diagram like this. This one only goes back to 800,000 years ago. And then we can basically take that oxygen isotope curve and figure out how much water, how much lower the ocean is at various periods of time, okay? So if we know we have to be a certain depth removed in order to expose a certain area as a land bridge, we can go to those curves and we can figure it out. And we'll come back to that later. That's an important thing. That really, for a long time, has been the main reason we know as far as the mechanism of how people got out of Africa, okay? There's this land bridge, this land piece up here that until they dug the Suez Canal has always been dry land, but there's been a basically a barrier, a climatic environmental barrier for hominids early on to move out of here. The Sahara Desert and things that aren't quite as Sahara-ish, but nonetheless, basically things that people can't move across very well early on, or that fauna that they're interested in wouldn't want to move across. But during lowered sea level, this area connects up, and there's lots of more coastal area exposed. And then down here in Southeast Asia, we have lots of land connections too. So there's lots of possibilities to get out. And that's what the story is going to be about here, is what goes on down here during this period. So here's Southeast Asia. Here's the island of Java right here, okay? This is Malaysia, Sumatra, Borneo. And during these low sea level stands, this sea level stand right here is minus 80 meters, okay? All this is exposed as land, and there's rivers that run across it. It's a real live landscape. These glacial periods last quite a while, a long time. You know, you wouldn't know you were in a glacial period in the tropics if you were hanging out there, because it would last much longer than the generational memory of that thing would, okay? So anyhow, during this low sea stands, you can see this is a landmass that basically all these islands are joined together with dry land connected to the Asian mainland. Water can also be a barrier, okay? There's some places where even if you remove 140 meters of water, you still have a deep enough trench or a deep enough ocean that you don't dry it out, and it's too hard for animals that can't swim well to get across. And that's, you know, a classic is Wallace's Line. This one here has been there. It's one of those. It's really deep. It's always been a barrier, at least during the last couple million years. And because of that, the faunas on this side are very distinct from the faunas on this side, because there's this barrier to movement here. So these barriers are important barriers. Okay, so let's go to Central Java. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to Central Java. Notice there's lots of mountains here and lowlands, so the browner, brighter areas are higher, the green areas are lower. And the sites we're going to be talking about are right in here. Java is just like Iowa. They grow corn. Not very much, though. This is the only corn I ever saw in Java, which was kind of cool. Yeah, And then I got a T-shirt for, I brought along some Hawkeye T-shirts to give away, and one of them had a corn thing on it, and I gave it to this guy in his house here. He was really into it. But yeah, it's totally about as different from Iowa as you can hope. It's there's teak trees. It's a tropical place. It also has lots of volcanoes. All those mountains are volcanoes. Okay, it's a place where one plate is going beneath another plate. Okay, and it's just like basically the coast of Washington and Oregon, the Cascades, really active, only even more active than that. Okay, in fact, Merapi, is the most dangerous volcano in the world because it's got the most population around it and it's super active. People have been here for a very long time. It's a very highly populated place. It's the most populated island in the world. Has the highest population density of a big landmass in the world. People have been there for a long, long time. Originally, Buddhists were the last people in. As far as the traditional societies, they were replaced by Muslim. And this is a buried Buddhist temple. It's buried by mud flows off this volcano here. So when we come in here, we come into this town here, which is Surakarta, or it's also called Solo City. It used to be called Solo all the time. And we either fly in or take the train. But anyhow, we arrive here because we have to file a lot of papers and stuff like that, pay off a few bureaucrats. And this is just some images of Solo City. It's a small metropolitan area in Indonesia. It's about 550,000 people. It occupies the same square mile area as Iowa City. Only there's 550,000 people there. There's, familiar chains there, okay? Unfamiliar chains. They don't have to actually worry about copyright here, I guess, because they didn't spell it that way. But there's also a lot of, most of the food you get is this sort of a stuff where it's open market, kind of, chopping up a few skates here or chopping some lamb up at the satay shop. But there's also nice deluxe hotels where we don't stay. So it's a real bustling city. But boy, the minute you get out of town, it's totally different. There's a few of the main roads are paved and in decent shape with crammed full of people, cars, and motorcycles. But once you get into the rural areas, it all turns into dirt and gravel roads, very little electricity, usually one line into houses. And then, these are traditional rural Javanese houses. There's some brick ones, the really wealthy people own the brick ones. Otherwise, there's some thatched palm leaf houses. There's also wooden houses. They have these villages, and the villages are small, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people. By their standards, really small. And it's agricultural, very much agricultural. Not row crop, it's rice. And in the hillier areas, like where we work in Sangaran, they mostly carve the paddies out of the valleys and make paddies that they flood seasonally and harvest the rice. You can usually get 1 or 2 crops of rice, and then when the rice is taken out, they plant beans, corn, peanuts, that sort of stuff in the same place. So it's constantly being cropped. There's also bananas, cassava. They'll grow teak trees. Teak's cash crop, okay, teak wood. Everything's done manually, by hand. There's no mechanization. Yeah, lots of. I was trying to get this guy. He had a cell phone. He was talking on the phone while he was doing his thing here. It's sort of a real culture clash kind of a situation, but I didn't get it. But yeah, they plow their fields with oxen and lots of hand labor. Women harvesting peanuts here. Here's cassava, which is a root crop that's grown along the edges of the fields, and it's ground up into a flour kind of thing. Water is cistern water, okay? Hand-dug kind of wells, and everybody bathes and washes their clothes and does their dishes in the river or the creek. So it's not quite like Iowa. And this hand mechanization or this hand labor thing extends clear up into all kinds of things. Like this is a quarry, okay? This is a sand and gravel quarry. Not a backhoe to be seen, okay? This is a rock quarry here. Here's a guy picking away with the rocks, and then they take those rocks, and then these people sit there and make little ones out of big ones all day long. And they load everything up onto these trucks that almost tip over and drive them away. But this is actually a boon for the fossil hunter because they're digging through this stuff and they find it. And fossils are worth a lot of money. This is a big issue here in Indonesia. There's a big market in human fossils. And one decent piece of a jaw of Homo erectus basically sets one of these rural people for life. They have everything they need. They're able to build one of these brick houses and have people work their fields and that sort of stuff. So we're lucky when we see them. Okay, let's go to Sanggaran then. So we're at Sanggaran, which is north of Solo, out in the rural area. And Sanggaran, like I said, is a place where there are a lot of Homo erectus fossils from Sanggaran. It's probably the most concentrated Homo erectus fossils in a decent-sized area. Individual sites have more, but Sanggaran has quite a few. And these are just a few of Sanggaran's various sorts of fairly good-sized skull remains. It's a World Heritage Site. Okay, so it's quote protected, but not really. There's no protection to really World Heritage. And this is what it looks like. This is a view from Bapong Hill, which is one of the places we work a lot, just sort of across the Sanggaran Dome. And there's a low-lying area here that extends off that's really big, and then there's this high rim area around the edge. This is Bapong Village down here, and this is during the dry season. Okay, so they have a monsoonal climate, a wet season, dry season. In the wet season, we don't go there because it rains all the time. Everything's covered with vegetation, and it's just impossible to get around. You can't get on the roads or anything. So we go in the dry season, and then you can see off in the distance there's Merapi and Lawu, big volcanoes. Okay, so this is a geologic map of the Sanggaran Dome. And that photo I just showed you was from right here, looking that way. Okay, so the highland off in the distance was this ridge here. Okay, now what this shows, just sort of in general, is the blue stuff is the oldest material, and then it gets progressively younger out here into the yellow stuff. Okay, and what that kind of outcrop pattern of rocks tells a geologist is that that's what's called a dome. Okay, and this has been domed up by mud volcanoes that have erupted through these clays that are down here at depth. And originally, this yellow extended across the whole top, got basically bulged up, and then the top's been eroded off with time. Okay, so we end up with this ring of outcrop, and we find the Homo erectus fossils in the upper part of this unit, the Sanggaran, and throughout this yellow, the Bapong. So this is just a stratigraphic section, idealized what kind of succession you have. Okay, so down here in the pure information, this is the area was covered with a shallow sea at this time. Okay, and then that sea started to shallow up until it was sort of like a big embayment. Then there was a big series of volcanic mud flows that entered this embayment and basically filled it up. After that, the embayment was occupied by an estuary, so you had the lower end of a large river that was entering the sea, which gradually turned into sort of a lake marsh. And then finally, right about here, large rivers started flowing across the area and invaded the area. And the whole time, this area is subsiding very slowly as all this sediment's piling up. So you have this really nice continuous record of sedimentation, which is just a great thing. And then Homo erectus fossils are found basically through this part of the sequence in the dome. So the way they're found is there are rare outcrops here and there that last about one season. And fossils erode out of here and roll down the bank, or else are found eroding out of the bank. Also, fossils are found pretty often when farmers extend their fields into the edges of these outcrops, or they try to go up a hill like this, and they'll find them as they're digging through. Now, lucky for us, there's also more things than just bones and sand in this stuff, okay? There are these little pieces of rock called pumice, a kind of rock called pumice, and it's a volcanic rock, an extrusive volcanic rock. It's basically lava that gets blown into the sky. These are very violent eruptive volcanoes, okay, like Mount St. Helens kind of style. And when they blow up, they'll send this material into the sky. It's full of bubbles, okay? Everybody knows about pumice, that, you know, you scrape off your heels with it, floats, that kind of stuff, okay? Well, the reason we're interested in pumice is because of these little black spots in that pumice, okay? These are hornblende dark mineral that's in the pumice. And that hornblende, you can apply a dating technique called argon-argon dating to. So we can actually figure out how old this pumice is. And if we find that pumice in here, it gives us a clue about how old the deposit that contains the pumice might be. Okay? So I'm going to show you a cross section. So we're going to go from here to here, and what it's going to be is just like a slice into the ground. Okay, so there's the bottom, there's the top. This is down. Here's the Sangaran Formation. This is this basically marshy lacustrine clay when we find the first fossils. And then there's a sequence of river deposits that are all stacked up. The yellow and orange are sand and gravel. The green is silts and clays. Okay, so this is basically deposits that are in the channel or point bars or stuff like that, okay, where there's a lot of energy. And this is overbank deposits. This is the mud on the floodplain, essentially. And we spent a lot of time figuring out where as many as we could of the fossils that had been found in Sangaran, where they came from in stratigraphic position. It took a lot of work, but these we feel very confident about. And we collected pumices. You can see the little black and red dots all over are all pumices. With these little numbers, these numbers are the argon-argon ages that we were able to get on the pumices. And so here's the, this is about 65 argon-argon ages summary here. What you do is you have to take multiple ages and you take the youngest one is the one, because it's the one, this is all transported sediment. And so you can move old stuff in younger material, but the youngest one is most likely to be the closest to the age of when it got moved around. So down here when this first big mud flow came in was about 2 million years ago. Homo erectus showed up somewhere in here. Okay, so between 1.66 and 1.5, and then the sequence goes up to about 1 million and younger than 1 million. We don't have any new ages off here yet. But Homo erectus seems to have been here for quite some time. And so, like I said before, the arrival, sometime 1.66, 1.5. We'll see why that's important. Okay, so back to the land bridges. When and how did Homo erectus arrive in Java? We know when, 1.66 to 1.5. We have evidence of the bones there, so it had to be at least by then, okay? And in order to get a land bridge to put somebody here, we got to go 50 to 60 meters lower in sea level than we are today. So it has to be during a glacial period, and has to be in a glacial period that is extensive enough to drop it at least 60 meters to basically make this connection right here. Okay, now what was the environment like, okay? In the end, I'm going to put this all together, hopefully. We'll see. Got a lot of options here. Is it a tropical rainforest? Parts of this area are today, or for sure areas to the north are today, which this is what most people think about when they think about island Southeast Asia, you know, some sort of heavily forested, really rainy place. And indeed it is sometimes. Maybe it was a tropical grassland. There are tropical grasslands, okay? Or maybe it was a savanna. A savanna is basically just this. It's open, very open trees. More grass than trees. Or it could be an open woodland, which is more trees than grass, okay? But any of these, including open woodland, are all possibilities, okay? So how do we figure out which it was, or was it all of them, or did it change from one to the other? There are faunal remains that inform us somewhat, but the question always is what's redeposited, what's not, what's associated with what's not. So it's not definitive. I work on soils, okay, and work with paleosols, and that's why I came into this project. And soils, basically, or paleosols, are soils that are formed on, in this case, buried land surfaces, okay? They're old soils on old landscapes. And in the succession we have in Sangaran Dome, there are lots of buried land surfaces down there, okay? And so what you can do is look at the soils, look at characteristics of the soils that tell you something about how the soils formed, what kind of environment they formed in, okay? And I'll show you a few things or talk about a couple things, but basically what you can do is you can begin to reconstruct landscape and vegetation settings, okay? So you can, for instance, tell if a high water table was present. You can tell if there was a dry season. You can tell if there's grass roots versus tree roots, you know, things like that you can tell. So I spent most of my time doing this sort of stuff, digging trenches, scraping away at walls, having guys make sure I don't fall off the ladder, filling little bags full of dirt that I have to talk the customs agents into letting me bring back into the country and stuff like that. So that's kind of what I do. and the Javanese, the farmers just sit there and go, "What are you doing? You know, I can move that for you real fast." You know. Anyhow, let's look at a couple of these. So here we're in the Sangha Formation. This is that first part that Homo erectus shows up in, and it's this paludal is just basically a fancy name for marsh. Okay, wet, mucky place, or lacustrine. Here's a picture of a Sangharan outcrop, and you can see the tilt here. That's the mud volcano tilt. Everything tilts towards the center of the dome. And this is a soil in the Sangharan Formation. So this soil is basically this peaty layer. Okay, it's a lignite, which is a kind of peat that's been really compressed. And it's buried by floodwater deposits. Okay? And in this one, indeed, we had plant remains. There's smashed ferns, and there's lots of fern pollen in here. And so what we can tell from this soil is a couple things. Number one, in order to preserve this peat, the water table has to be right at the land surface. Because if you drop the water table very much, you oxidize the peat and it decomposes. Okay? So this is pretty much a marsh, ever wet kind of situation. The plant remains told us what kind of plants it was. It was ferns, okay, and the pollen too. So we know from what we have here, and then it's all stacked up. And you know, keep in mind with time, what's going on is the basin is slowly subsiding while stuff keeps piling up. So we have a really nice big stacked up sequence. So we have places that are really wet marshes, no surprise, okay? But we also have other kinds of things here. Here's another soil right here, okay? This one doesn't have a peat on it, so it doesn't have that organic material, that peaty, ever wet stuff on top. Okay, it's also got these little brown things which you probably can't see because the light's on there. Are root traces, small roots, and then these little white blotches down here are soil carbonate nodules. Okay, we know in this case, based on the kind of carbonate nodule they are, by looking at them in thin section, these represent soil carbonate as opposed to groundwater. So they represent the fact that this soil intermittently dried out for those to form, okay? But it also has quite a bit of organic material, although not peat, okay? And it has roots. So what this tells us is that we've got a soil situation where water table is fluctuating. There are dry seasons when we accumulate carbonate, and we've got plants that have bigger roots, shrubs and stuff like that. And then I think this is the last one I'm going to bore you with here. Here's another different kind. This is this whole soil right here. This one has big roots, indicating trees of some sort. It also has these little light gray things that are all over here, which are called slickensides. And what these are really clay soils, and when they dry out, they crack open because the clays swell. The clays actually shrink when it dries out. They crack open, and then stuff falls in them when it's cracked open, and when it gets re-wetted, it shrinks back up, and since there's material where it didn't used to be, it pushes some of it aside, and you get these intersecting, slick, striated looking things that are called slickensides. Texas right now, central, southern, coastal Texas is full of the open crack variety right now, and the next time it starts raining, they're going to close up. That's one of the classic areas for those kind of soils. They're called vertisols, but what they represent is that you've got an extended dry season and a wet season, an extended dry season and a wet season. And we have carbonate nodules, and then we have indicators down here that the water table is fluctuating up in this zone. So in this case, we've got trees with some grass, a dry season, a wet season, and a deeper water table. So what we can do is we can put these things back onto the landscape, and we can reconstruct the landscape with them. So this is the upper Sangharan Formation. This is basically when Homo erectus shows up. We're looking at some sort of a estuary kind of a thing here, or an arm of a lake. And down here in the lowest lying areas, we have these fern marshes, okay? On parts of the lake margin that are farther removed, that are a little bit higher, we have these situations where we have low shrubs and some grasses, maybe some ferns too, but the water table fluctuates a little bit. And then on the higher lying parts of the area, we have these open forests or open shrublands that are have a season of wet and a season of dry. Okay? So by putting all the soils together, we can really get a pretty good idea of local conditions as well as sort of regional things. With this big wet dry, that's a regional climatic thing. So if we move into the Bapong Formation, we can also do the same sort of thing, and I'm not going to go through all these soils here, but with the Bapong Formation, it's upward finding sequences, like I said, sand and gravel from in the channel, point bars and stuff, overlain by silts and clays. This is the upper part of the floodplain, and then there's a whole series of these all stacked up. In the Bapong, we have a bunch of different kinds of soils. This one's unique to the Bapong. It's one where it has tree roots and shrub roots, lots of carbonate nodules, and lots of burrows. And the burrows are good-sized burrows, either mammals or lizards. So these kinds of burrows tell you that the water table wasn't ever up in that part of the soil at all. That's not the part that gets water tabled. And so here's the reconstruction of farther up in the section, basically 1.3. So this is in the middle of when Homo erectus is in there, where we've got places that are higher up, more well-drained. We have low-lying floodplain areas. We have gallery forests along part of the floodplain. We have some wet seepy areas, probably where high areas intersect lower areas. A much more diverse landscape than we did early on in the Sangaran. So what the paleosols tell us then? What's the whole, basically the summary is, Sangaran Formation, we've got poorly drained, organic-rich settings, and we have these vertisols, these soils that shrink and swell, which tells us we have a wet season and a dry season. As we go up into the Bapong and higher up into the Bapong Formation, there's a lot more soil carbonate accumulation, and it continues to increase going upward through time. That usually indicates some sort of a drying trend. The drier you get to a point, the more carbonate you get. Root traces become pretty abundant, much more abundant, and they get a lot finer as you go up into the Bapong. They also go shallower into the soil, all suggesting these might be grasses, okay? So we're looking at a drying trend and maybe an increase in grass vegetation too as we go up with time. But some paleosols low in the Bapong have properties of modern forest soils or close forest soils. So, and these are the ones we think are along these gallery forests, right along the rivers. And paleosols higher in the section then have properties of modern savanna soils. They have grasses with some trees, but mostly grasses are increasing upward. So just to sort of reiterate, we've got a pretty wet place, low-lying, marshy, but seasonal drying. And seasonal drying in this part of the world is probably monsoon. Okay, that's what happens today. That's probably what we've got. That's essentially what's going on in Texas. It's at least present somewhat as early as 1.6 million. Okay. About 1.5 million, a really large braided river system entered the basin and filled up the marshes, basically. Okay, and the Bapong Formation began to accumulate. The paleosol information suggests that as the Bapong accumulated, things became drier, progressively drier, or at least the dry seasons got more pronounced. You can't really figure out the difference between total precipitation and a dry season very easily here, but the dry season got more pronounced. So here's what it looked like when Homo erectus, or at least what, one idea of what it might look like when Homo erectus shows up. And it's more like this, though, during most of the time that Homo erectus is there. So the environment is pretty darn diverse further along Homo erectus gets in this place. Okay, so we got Homo erectus coming in here between 1.6 and 1.5. Sea levels lower than 150 meters or than 60 meters. And the sun to shelf out here is occupied by a really extensive tropical grassland, really low-lying area out here, okay? Savanna, and then there's also open forest. So you probably got marshes around the rivers and the low-lying, big low-lying areas, grasslands, probably rimming that, and then up onto the edge of the higher areas, savannas in between, and then closed woodlands, maybe gallery forests along the rivers, and closed woodlands on the higher elevations too. So these glacial period vegetation mosaics, this huge mosaic area, provided really ideal conditions for faunal and human migration through the area, okay? The important thing to remember is that Homo erectus is just part of the fauna, okay? it's an animal in with the rest of the animals, and it's just sort of making a living with the rest of the animals. And so rather than striving out and heading its way towards Southeast Asia, it's just following the critters. Now, this is Africa, and I just want to point out something here. This is Africa doesn't stay the same, and no continent stays the same from glacial to interglacial periods, okay? There's big changes that take place. Today, this is sort of the situation in Africa, and I want to focus in on this area here. This is the Rift Valley where Homo erectus's ancestors evolved and where at least the predecessor to Homo erectus evolved, okay? So this is the likely conditions that predecessor and the earliest Homo erectus were probably adapted to. And you can see it's a mosaic. It's a savanna, a little tropical rainforest over here, but mostly savanna, woodlands, and scrub. Now, when you go into a glacial maximum, what happens with Africa, it really dries out, and the savanna and grasslands expand at the expense of the tropical rainforest. But you still end up with a mosaic in here of savanna, grassland, and scrub. You get into the wettest part of this cycle, okay? This is the Middle Holocene in Africa, but any sort of early interglacial, you end up with, once again, this patchwork, savanna, scrub, woodland. So these critters, these early humans are probably adapted to this patchwork and really do their thing in savanna and grassland and open areas. They're not a closed forest kind of person, or closed forest kind of critter. So what does this tell us about these migration routes then? Let's come back to what might be going on, or what possibly could be happening. First thing is that many of these environments that we're encountering in this early and middle Pleistocene Southeast Asia are not very unlike those in East Africa, okay? They're the same sorts of things. There's savannas, there's marshy areas, there's open woodlands, and there's grasslands. Another thing to consider, and I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit, is that Asian Homo erectus fossils aren't found just throughout Asia, throughout Eastern Asia at all. There's a bipolar distribution. There's a group of Homo erectus localities in the north of China, and there's the Javan Homo erectus, and nothing in between. So that brings us to a little fauna story here. This is, so here's Asia. This is where the Homo erectus fossil sites are in China. This is where they are in Java, and there are none in here. This is Russ Shahan's idea, and I think it's a really good idea, is that this distribution might be related to something else, okay? And rather than just people wanting to be here and wanting to be here, or us not finding things in between. And that has to do with the Stegodon alauropoda fauna, which is Stegodon's sort of an elephant-like thing, and the other is a panda, big panda, okay? Lots of other animals in the fauna too. This fauna ranges from the early Pleistocene to the late Pleistocene, which is the entire range of Homo erectus in Asia, okay? So this fauna was there. Here's its distribution in the green right here, okay? It's indicative of a closed canopy environment, okay? So big closed canopy forests, not open environments. No Homo erectus fossils are found in the large number of faunas of this fauna that are found. There's a ton of sites that have this fauna. No Homo erectus fossils have been found in them. There have been some that have been purported to be in them, but reinvestigations have shown that a lot of them are from a mystery ape. There's a mystery ape in this fauna that hasn't been, they have teeth, but nothing else so far. And so really what's going on is the forest is an ecological barrier. Okay? It doesn't allow the fauna that Homo erectus is moving with, relying upon, to move through here. And so, you know, we have this barrier, and it doesn't allow a mixing to be taking place here. So this really, I think, informs us a lot about what's going on with the earliest migration routes, based on the ages, the environments, and what we now know about this fauna and its distribution. The first migration route, more or less, was probably this, or out of Africa. I've got it up here at Dmanisi. More and more people are starting to believe that Homo erectus may have evolved actually at Dmanisi, or Dmanisi in the Caucasus somewhere. Basically came out of Africa as Homo ergaster, and then evolved into Homo erectus, and then moved back into Africa as Homo erectus. The earliest Homo erectus is at Dmanisi. And in fact, the earliest Homo erectus in Sangaran is older than the earliest Homo erectus in the Rift Valley. But anyhow, probably some sort of evolution out here, Caucasus or Africa, and then a coastal route. Keep in mind, during low sea stands, we have coastal plain that becomes land, okay? That's nice flat land. It has grasslands and savannas and stuff like that on it, okay? Probably didn't, it wasn't, okay, let's get going, it's glacial, time to leave Dmanisi, we better get walking fast. It probably took a few glacial periods to move on down through here, okay? But we know, entered here sometime around 1.6 or so, which was definitely a good period, a good strong glacial to get in there. Subsequently, there was another migration that went over the northern route and eventually down into the Yangtze. And this is the group that populates the Homo erectus population of North China. The oldest well-dated fossils in North China are about 1.3 million Homo erectus fossils. There have been purported examples of 1.6. I don't think most people except the Chinese reporters believe that's really true, okay? But at this point of the game, it looks indeed like the Chinese Homo erectus are a little later in time than these down here, and definitely younger than the stuff at Dmanisi. So, Du Bois' original idea that Homo evolved in Asia and spread to the rest of the world, we haven't believed that basically since the 60s, but for sure this is not going on here. And basically we've learned quite a few things, and there's a lot more we don't know that the more questions we seem to answer, the more questions we have, okay? But basically the things I think that are important is that Southeast Asia during glacial periods isn't that much different than the Rift Valley as far as being environments available. So there's not a lot of adaptation change. You don't have to adapt to a wholly new thing to get here, okay? So it's not like a major change in lifestyle needed to get to Southeast Asia. Glacial periods are really the ones that provide the proper ecological conditions and geographic conditions for populations to move. And we're mostly talking about populations of fauna, grazers and browsers that occupy these environments, and Homo erectus is tagging along with them, exploiting them. Another interesting thing is that, you think, okay, you got a Homo erectus population in Sunda having a good time during the glacial period, but then the good time ends because interglacial happens, okay? During interglacials, sea level rises much faster than it drops during a glacial period because glaciers melt faster than they build up, okay? So basically, at the beginning of an interglacial, the Homo erectus in Sunda gets concentrated onto the islands, what are now the islands, okay? So really they're like the first environmental refugees in a big way, okay? So we're not talking about rising a meter of sea level in 50 years. We're talking about rising 60 meters in 100 years and stuff like that, really, really rapid rises. And then the other thing is this ecological barrier persisted in Southeast Asia through the entire time that Homo erectus was present in Asia. And it likely isolated the two populations. Okay, so there was no interchange. There's no probably major genetic relationship other than what goes back to probably the Caucasus. Okay, so they're isolated populations, and it would make a really interesting study from that point of view. There are some differences in morphology, not major differences, but genetically would be really interesting if we ever get lucky enough to find something that has DNA preserved in it. So, thanks a lot.